evening and welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to have to ask some of you standing in the back. I'm not quite sure if that's a fire hazard, but there's a lot of seats available, so I would encourage everyone to please take their seats. So welcome. This is the second technically event put on by Students for Justice in Palestine, a chapter recently opened here at UC Irvine, in co-sponsorship with the publication Al-Kalima. We would like to bring you a guest speaker, Ben White. Just a little bit about him before he comes up to speak. Mr. White is a freelance journalist and writer specializing in the Palestinian and Israel conflict. He has regularly been visiting the Middle East since 2003 for periods of between 2 weeks and 3 months at a time. His first book, Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide, was published in 2009 and received praise from the likes of Desmond Tutu and Kara Karmi. Ian Pratt called White a strong and clear voice, while Ali Al-Gunama described the book as an essential reading. A short review of the book from Amazon, actually, is this book provides one of the best introductions to the Israel-Palestine conflict. It reveals what mainstream media in the West seeks to conceal from the public, that Israel has an apartheid regime which has been obsessed with demographic racism and ethnic cleansing for 6 decades. So on that note, I'd like to welcome Mr. White to come up and give a speak.
Well, good evening to everybody, and I'd like to extend my thanks and appreciation to everybody who's got out here tonight, and especially also to the student organisers of this event this evening. Now, I'm going to do a presentation, and I'm going to try and keep it reasonably brief and efficient. And then, of course, there's going to be a time for questions and answers as well. So, of course, as I kind of go through, if there's some things that you'd like me to come back to in the Q&A, or there's some things I don't mention that you'd like to bring up, then make a mental note or a paper note of some kind, and then we'll have the time for questions after the presentation as well. Now, this is the title of the presentation this evening. I'm just going to give you a brief idea of the way I'm going to go in terms of an outline. So the first section that I'm going to do is actually going to just be talking a little bit about the concept or the framework of apartheid applied to Palestine, Israel, historically and today. And just to understand better, what do people mean when they talk about Israeli apartheid or apartheid in the Middle East? The second section, which will be the biggest section in terms of time spent, that's going to be really a focus on looking at examples of Israeli policies towards the Palestinians for over 60 years. And I'll say more about that when we get there. And then right at the end, make a point 3, and we'll have a conclusion to round things off. Also, just like to say as well that, of course, inevitably, you try and give a lecture in a reasonably short amount of time, there's going to be things that I can't say, particularly in terms of the policies, the examples of policies. But hopefully this will make some coherent sense, and other issues you can feel free to bring up in the Q&A. Now, the title of my book, Israeli Apartheid, Beginner's Guide, obviously there's other books, there's other literature and analysis around that use the concept of apartheid. And even today, in 2010, to talk about apartheid in Palestine, Israel, is considered controversial, or it's disputed, it's considered polemical, etc. And so it's good to clear up some misunderstandings or some confusion about what is being said and what isn't being said when we talk about apartheid there. Obviously, this is one of the reasons why it's disputed, either disingenuously or otherwise, is because it's implicitly making a comparison with what happened in South Africa, historically speaking. Of course, this is where we get the term apartheid, an Afrikaans word, and it's so people assume that when you're talking about Israeli apartheid or apartheid in Palestine, Israel, that what's being said is that what happens there is exactly the same as what happened in South Africa, which is a kind of a directly comparable analogy. But in fact, nobody's actually saying that at all. There is a comparison to be made with what's happened in South Africa, and that produces, when you kind of do an analysis, comparative analysis, there are similarities, and there are also important differences. And I'm not going to spend time going to those now, but if anybody wants to bring those up in questions, that'd be great. But the main point to emphasize here is that there is a definition of apartheid independent of what took place in South Africa, though obviously, of course, owing a lot to those events. And just to give you an example of what we're talking about here, here's a particular convention from the United Nations General Assembly in 1973, and it defined apartheid in general, in generic terms, and it listed, obviously, a variety of examples of what constituted apartheid. Part of that is the denial of certain rights, and they listed examples of rights that are denied in the context of apartheid. This is just a sample. The denial of the right to leave and to return to their country, the right to a nationality, the right to freedom of movement and residence. This is another example here from the International Criminal Court statute adopted in 1998. Again, it defined apartheid, and this is part of the definition. Just to read it out to you: inhumane acts, and then here's a key bit, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Now, I stress the key bit there, because when you talk about apartheid, and when we look at what's going on in Palestine, Israel, we're not just talking about a series of isolated human rights abuses. I mean, some of the policies that we'll look at here today, they're human rights abuses in and of themselves, but they're occurring in a wider context. They're human rights abuses that are being applied with specific strategic aims in mind. So just to emphasize that in this beginning moment, the comparison with South Africa is not how we ultimately test whether to talk about Israeli apartheid is appropriate or not, because we have this independent definition that we can take and we can apply it to a situation and we can see if it's appropriate or not appropriate. And that point was made in the foreword to my book. The foreword to my book was written by Professor John Dugard, who is a South African legal professor, and he served as Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, a UN position, and this is what he said. Ben White and other people obviously does not, however, say that South African apartheid and Israel's treatment of Palestinians are exactly the same. That is why he calls it Israeli apartheid. It is Israel's version of a system that has been universally condemned. So with that understanding of apartheid in mind, the idea, we're not talking about a direct analogy with South Africa, we're talking about these definitions of apartheid. I want to start looking at some specific examples of policies that Israel has been implementing towards the Palestinians for over 60 years. And I'm going to do this by dividing it into 3 sections, for reasons I'll explain in a second. I'm going to divide this into 3 sections, looking at the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Palestinians who are in East Jerusalem, and the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Now, why making this division is kind of necessary or perhaps useful? The reason why it's useful is because actually Israel's regime of control differs in these different places vis-a-vis the Palestinian population. The Palestinians in these areas have different grades, as it were, of rights. So, for example, obviously you can see the category A, the Palestinian minority inside the state of Israel, are full citizens. So you need to look at the way Israel's relating to the Palestinians almost kind of in these 3 categories because of the way in which the regime towards them, implemented by Israel, also differs. There's an important caveat there, of course, which is that half of the world's Palestinian people aren't represented on this slide because those are the Palestinian refugees, right? The Palestinian diaspora, the Palestinians who were expelled and ethnically cleansed in 1948 and their descendants, in what you could perhaps describe as the first dramatic acts of Israeli apartheid. So we're going to look at some policy examples related to Palestinians in these 3 areas to illustrate this idea of apartheid. Now, personally speaking, I think it's an interesting, the first category is perhaps one of the more interesting ones to look at. Why? Because the Palestinian citizens of Israel are not part, for example, of the official peace process. Palestinian citizens of Israel are not well, the issues they face are not well understood or not well appreciated. They're 20% of the population. They've often been referred to, or still referred to, as so-called Israeli Arabs or Arab Israelis. And that's been part of a deliberate kind of propaganda effort by the Israeli state to fragment the Palestinian identity and to deny, of course, the identity of the Palestinian identity of that minority. The Palestinian minority inside Israel are those Palestinians who managed to remain in 1948. Some of them were displaced, which I'll come to in a moment. So just let's look at the nature of Israeli policies towards the Palestinian minority since 48? Well, until 1966, from 48 to 66, Palestinians inside Israel, who had become citizens, were under martial law. Okay, they were subject to military rule. So if you take, for example, an area like the Galilee, which I'll come back to in a moment, an area in the north of Israel, which is, traditionally speaking, had a higher proportion, historically speaking, has had a higher proportion of Palestinian citizens. The area of the Galilee was under military law, and the Palestinian citizens there were subject to the same kind of restrictions that you see today in the West Bank, in terms of you needing a permit to move around, this kind of thing. The military law was used to clamp down on political activity. And the military law over the Palestinian minority was also used, along with legislation passed in the Knesset, to affect what is perhaps the defining dynamic of the relationship between the Israeli state and the Palestinian minority, which is land confiscation. The scale of the land confiscation that took place was large. You can see in the first 30 years of the state's existence, by the mid-70s, the average Palestinian community inside Israel, remember we're not talking here about the West Bank, which we'll come to, but the average Palestinian community inside Israel of citizens had lost between 2/3 and 3/4 of its land, on average. Expropriated, transferred, as it were, the ownership of the land transferred, taken from those Palestinian communities and handed over to the state or to parastate agencies. Now you can imagine, of course, the consequences for these communities of that kind of scale of land confiscation and expropriation. Often small communities, agricultural-based, rural economy. So they were being choked from the very first, and most of the land confiscation took place particularly in the 50s, in the kind of first few years. I just mentioned the role of parastate agencies, and that's been an important part of the way that Israel's dispossessed the Palestinian people. I'll just give an example here, the Jewish National Fund. I'm not sure about the case in the States, but in the UK, they have charitable status. You can make tax-exempt donations to them. And in 1950, 2 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, the Jewish National Fund had gained 40% of Palestinian abandoned land. Of course, abandoned is somewhat of a euphemism here. It's abandoned in what sense? It's abandoned in the sense that the Palestinian owners had become refugees and were forbidden from returning back to their homes. So their property, which was confiscated by the state, the Israeli state, was then sold to the Jewish National Fund, which is constitutionally bound, of course, as well, to exist for the benefit of Jewish people. And they gained 40% of this so-called abandoned land by 1950. Another aspect of reality for Palestinians inside Israel since 48 has been this phenomenon of present absentees. It's a strange construction, right? It looks like a bit of an oxymoron there, a paradox. What does that mean? Well, this is referring to a section of the Palestinian community inside the state, represent about 1 in 4 of all Palestinian citizens, who are effectively internally displaced peoples. So unlike most of the Palestinian refugees, who found themselves the wrong side of the new borders and prevented from returning, these are Palestinians who were displaced from their homes, who fled or were expelled, but managed to stay within what then became Israel. But because they'd fled their homes and their villages, or had been expelled, their land was still confiscated in the legislation that Israel implemented. So just to give you an idea of what that means, in a personal level, there's a family that I know in Nazareth, right, which is the biggest Palestinian city inside Israel, and the grandmother of this family, who's still alive, her family home, is minutes away from their house in Nazareth. But it was taken from the family, and they were never able to get it back. I've said I'm going to return to the Galilee, so I'm just going to do that for a moment now, to talk about this phenomenon of Judaization, or Judaizing the Galilee and the Negev. Even more euphemistically, this has been called developing the Galilee and the Negev. And we just need to take a look at this because it's illustrative of the kind of politics that shapes key Israeli strategic thinking on a domestic level. Like I said, the Galilee has, historically speaking, had a higher proportion of Palestinian citizens compared to Jewish citizens. The same with the Negev and Nakab in the south. That meant since 48, it's been a strategic aim at a state level, at a regional level, to Judaize the areas. In other words, to boost the Jewish population in comparison to the Palestinian population. Now, that's connected